Stewart.
Okay. This is not something that began in Libya. It's not something that's going to end in Libya. This came out of a whole regional situation. This is a response primarily to Egypt and Tunisia. And the reason we should be celebrating, but with immense caution, what both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have supported is because of that broader regional context. Not one country, not 1 month, but a series of countries and 30 years. And we have to keep our eyes on that. Or I believe we're going to find ourselves in a very dangerous and difficult situation. The situation in Libya, the reason for the no-fly zone, is driven, of course, as everybody in this House has said, by our humanitarian obligation to the Libyan people. It is driven by our concerns for national security, and it's driven probably most of all, and this isn't something we should minimize, by the kind of message we're trying to pass to people in Egypt or Tunisia. If we had stood back at this moment and done nothing, if we had allowed Gaddafi to simply hammer Benghazi, people in Egypt and Tunisia and in Syria would have concluded that we were on the side of oil-rich regimes against their people. We would have no progressive narrative with which we could engage with that region over the next 3 decades.
On that note, my honourable friend give way?
Yes, please. Yep.
I thank my honourable friend for giving away. On that particular point, would he agree that it is incredibly significant that both the Arab League and specific countries in the area like Qatar are supporting the engagement in the UN resolution?
I agree very strongly. That is immensely significant, but the meaning of that needs to be clear. The reason why the limits which the Prime Minister has set are so important to all of us is exactly because of that point. The reason we need the Arab League on side, the reason we need the UN on side, the reason we need a limited resolution, the reason all those comments around the House about the warnings of this not becoming another Iraq are so important is because this is about 30 years, not just about the next few months. So I would say that respectfully, I would disagree with the member from Fife. I think the most important thing for us now is to be careful with our language, careful with our rhetoric, careful with the kinds of expectations that we raise. I would respectfully say that words like "this is necessary," even words like "this is legitimate," are dangerous. All these things the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have done to hedge us around, to limit us, to say this isn't going to be an occupation, are fantastic, but they're only the beginning. Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. Does he agree that one of the risks is that what might be said on the Arab street is that we wouldn't be interested if it wasn't for the oil in Libya?
I think that's a very, very important danger. The fact that this is a country which is not just an Arab country, but a country with oil, is something we have to bear in mind. The kind of legitimacy we might have had in Kosovo is going to be more difficult in Libya for that reason. But the biggest dangers, the dangers we take away from Afghanistan, are threefold. And this is why the Prime Minister is going to have to stick so hard to his commitment. It's very easy for us to say today, so far and no further. But all the lesson of Afghanistan is that if you dip your toes in, you are very soon up to your neck. And that's because of the structure of this kind of rhetoric. It's because of the ways in which we develop 4 kinds of fears, 2 kinds of moral obligation, and an entire institutional pressure behind reinvestment. That's why the former Secretary of Defence, the member for North East Coventry, is correct to raise these cautions. What are the 4 fears? We can hear them already. Right? Firstly, people are saying we have to be terrified of Gaddafi himself. He is an existential threat to global security. So that's the fear of the rogue state. The second kind of fear, which we're hearing already, is the fear of the failed state. Gaddafi is making that argument himself. If I collapse, Al-Qaeda is going to come roaring into Libya. The third kind of fear that people are beginning to make is a fear of neighbours. They're beginning to say already, if this collapses, refugees are going to pour across the borders into other countries. And the fourth kind of fear is fear of ourselves, fear of our credibility. If, in response to our imprecations, if in response to our threats he remains, we may look ridiculous. We've seen the same fears in Vietnam, where they were called the domino theory. We've seen the same threats in Iraq when people talked about weapons of mass destruction. We've seen the same fears in Afghanistan when people worry that if Afghanistan topples, Pakistan will topple and mad mullahs will get their hands on nuclear weapons. The same fears. And the same sense of moral obligation. You don't need to be able to name 2 cities in Libya to be able to talk about 2 kinds of moral obligation. Our moral obligation to the Libyan people, and our moral obligation because we sold arms to the Libyans in the past. This is very, very dangerous. It's very dangerous because we must, again and again, get out of that kind of language and get into a language which is humble, which accepts our limits, which says, yes, we do have a moral obligation to the Libyan people, but it's a limited moral obligation because we have a moral obligation to many other people in the world, particularly a moral obligation to our own people in this country. Secondly, of course we have a national security interest in Libya, but we have a national security interest in 40 or 50 countries around the world, and we must match our resources to our priorities. The real lessons of all these conflicts is not, as we imagine, that we must act. The real lessons of these conflicts is not just our failure, but our failure to acknowledge our failure, our desire to dig ever deeper, our inability to acknowledge that in the Middle East there are many people who are going to put a very sinister interpretation on our actions. A failure to acknowledge that ought implies can. You don't have a moral obligation to do what you cannot do. That we have to consider our resources rather than our desires. What does this mean? Well, it means, and this is something that's very easy for somebody on the back bench to say, and much more difficult for a Prime Minister or a leader to say. How do you set a passionately moderate rhetoric? How do you speak to people to support something which is important? Acknowledge the moral obligation, acknowledge the national security, but set the limits so you don't get too deep. I would suggest this. We need to put it already in the most realistic and limited terms. We need to say, firstly, that our objective here is primarily humanitarian. Primarily our objective is to decrease the likelihood of massacre, ethnic cleansing, civil war, and increase the likelihood of a peaceful political settlement. Secondly, we will try, insofar as it's within our power, to contain and manage any threat from Libya. And finally, we will deliver development and humanitarian assistance. But in the end, the real message that we're passing through limited rhetoric is not to the people of Britain, but to the people of the Middle East, and to the people of the Middle East over the next 30 years. Thank you very much.